Good evening. I'm Robert Benson. I'm going to talk to you about a dissertation I did with Walden University. For openers, I just want to give credit to my dissertation chair, Dr. Carol Kerr-Swanger, and the other committee member, who was Dr. Elizabeth Wilson. The title of the dissertation was Managing the General Aviation Facility, a Phenomenological Study of North Carolina Airport Managers. For an introduction and kind of an overview of what I'm going to discuss, I'm going to talk about the summary statement, or which is the abstract. I'm going to talk about the problem statement and tell you what's in there. I'll talk about the conceptual framework and the methodology used to conduct the study. And I'll talk about the literature review and the emissions that were in the literature review that led to the actual study. I'll talk about the research questions that I used to talk to the participants, which will segue into the participants themselves and the actual environment in which they function. I'll talk about the findings, the limitations of the study, and I'll talk about recommendations for action and future research. I'll also discuss social change implications, which is significant because Walden's creed, if you will, is to do work that facilitates positive social change. From there, I'll conclude, summarize, and entertain any questions you may have. The problem statement simply states this. From 2004 to 2009, there were 19 aircraft accidents originating from, occurring at or near North Carolina airports, 18 of which occurred at general aviation facilities, accounting for over 90% of all accidents. As only about half, 62 of 110 of the facilities in North Carolina are general aviation facilities, there is a disproportionate number of accidents occurring at GA facilities. This presents a challenge for any manager or public entity with the responsibility of managing general aviation facilities and preventing these occurrences. Couple the challenge of preventing aviation accidents with the general aviation management of any public organization, which these facilities are, there is a need for a template of performance for all in general aviation in general, particularly managers, to base future decisions and actions on. So, the conceptual framework. The framework I used to conduct this study is qualitative, and it's a phenomenological study. I use a phenomenological study, and this phenomenological study is derived from its conceptual framework from prior studies in the aviation industry. Essentially what I've done is I've used other studies as a basis for this study that I took. I'll refer to 5 of them here. One was Sharp in 1989. Sharp studied the efficacy of African American students in aviation science programs in the state of Florida. There's an academic implication there. Oderman in 2004 investigated to determine the need for ethics in aviation curriculums. Another academic proportion, if you will. Rodriguez and Bajota in 2003 conducted a study to determine if performance measurement, strategic planning, and performance-based budgeting were taking place at local and regional airports in Illinois. There is a aviation/state implication there. And then Rankin in 2008 conducted a study on runway incursions, which is a safety measure in aviation. And then Carmichael et al., 2003, researched aviation professionals in Oklahoma. So all of these studies formed a background or a backup, if you will, of which I based my study on. Now for the methodology. This again was a qualitative, interpretive research phenomenological process using in-depth interviews, surveys, recursive interactions with the airport managers of those facilities. Data were collected and analyzed through ecology, phenomenological research, and the imaginative variation, which are all elements of a phenomenological study. Following the tenets of phenomenological research fostered my bracketing of my experiences in ensuring ethical protections of the participants. And what bracketing is essentially me separating myself from the research to where I wasn't throwing any bias into it at all, even though at the time, the people who I was doing a study on were peers of mine. It's very important to bracket yourself accordingly because, again, you could have some influences on the data presented that you don't want to present, or you don't want to exude, if you will, for lack of a better term. For more on the methodology, the data were conceptualized, coded, and categorized in the categories using themes and the qualitative research software of NVivo 9.0. And I use other software programs as well. But all data and information, they are going to be maintained and have been maintained according to Walden University's IRB standards, which is essentially to keep the data for about 7 years in case you requested to produce that information. And also protect the privacy of the individuals who participated. The use of NVivo 9.0 provided data gathering and sorting options with enhanced capability for this particular research. So literature review, let's talk about the literature review. The literature review covered two primary areas. Basically, we talked about change and aviation-specific items. So, literature as it related to change in public organizations and evaluated literature pertaining to aviation industry in general. So what I did is because I'm dealing with and was talking about how managers deal with change, my research and my review of literature looked at change and any literature that had to do with aviation, hence the other data and research I mentioned earlier as far as the conceptual framework. But the aviation literature looks into the statutes, laws, and policies about the aviation facility as a public organization and its governing body. Very significant because the governing body of aviation facilities differ. It could be a municipality. It could be a governing body or a board or anything like that. As you read through the dissertation, you'll find out that there's different forms of managing an aviation facility. And so what caused me to want to do this research, or what was my need to do the research? Well, there was an omission I saw. I saw a gap in the literature. There weren't any literature available that addressed specific areas, and those specific areas were existing studies and literature in the aviation community. They center on operational areas to include those conducted at aviation facilities in general, as well as investigating various methods of funding them. But none of the literature specifically addressed, none of it specifically addressed the general aviation facility in the state of North Carolina or its managers. You noticed I mentioned before that there were studies conducted in Oklahoma, Illinois, Florida, but nothing in particular at that time addressed North Carolina. So there was the need for this particular project filled a gap of literature in those places. Okay, so I've given you the reasons why I did the study. There was a gap in the literature. I used a backdrop of other studies that were available. So now we get the approval to do the study. I've done all of the steps that need to be taken. So now I get to the point where I'm ready to conduct the research. So I've found the participants. Now I've asked the participants questions. So those questions were, what are the major obstacles to change in North Carolina airport organizations? That was one. The second question was, what processes influence implementation of operational policy at North Carolina airports? How do North Carolina airports respond to demands for change, whether from government or private sources? And what primary factors drive change in North Carolina airports that they were associated with in particular? Now, this next slide talks about the participants. Overall, I interviewed 10 airport managers, which is a sample of 10 to 20% of the actual general aviation facilities in the state. So we'd like to think that was a representative sample. But I actually tried to get participants from various parts of the state with different skill levels. But basically what I did was with the participants was I developed a spreadsheet that indicated different things about them. Obviously the region where they were from, as I said before, I went all over the state and I got someone from each of the different regions. Northeastern area, southeastern, the capital area, which is Raleigh, the central area of the state, and the southern areas, of course. But And I gave them all a nickname, if you will, about how I remembered them, because I couldn't, obviously, because it's a research project, you cannot mention people's names and the actual facility. So I used nicknames. For instance, one of the airports, I called it the 4 cents. And the reason why I called it 4 cents is because one of the practices that they did was whenever someone sold fuel at that facility, every employee at that facility got 4 cents off of the gallon that was fuel that was sold. A major incentive as far as being able to motivate people to do work. Now, there's some other ethical implications with that particular thing, but that's outside of the scope of this particular briefing. But one thing I did note about them was that they all had at least a college degree, a 4-year degree, and they were all affiliated with the American Association of Airport Executives. But the one main demographic that is probably something that needs to be looked into later on is that all of them were white males. There was no other demographic who was running any other facility in the state of North Carolina that was anything other than a white male. Not specific to this particular presentation, but as we'll get along, you'll see I recommend that that's possibly a topic for future research. So, findings. I came up with 15 findings, and I categorized them into 3 venues. Okay. The findings describe the convoluted and tenuous nature of the environment these leaders function in. The managers of the facilities are constantly engrossed in the interchanges of group dynamics, while simultaneously complying with, facilitating, and participating in federalism and intergovernmental relations. Very, very significant, because federalism essentially is dealing with the various levels of government. All of those facilities, in any aviation facility, has to deal with every level of government, because they have to deal with the state, they have to deal with the local government, be it a county or a city or what have you. But every one of them are governed by federal statutes, FAA primarily, because of the requirements for safety as far as airfields and things like that. The but the Transportation Security Administration, which is a Department of Homeland Security, those are big federal organizations that every aviation facility has to comply with. Hence the intergovernmental relations. The federalism. Now, intergovernmental relations is another issue, because you're not just dealing with echelons of government organizations, you're dealing with a number of them. And you're also dealing with non-governmental organizations that all play a part in the meshing, if you will, in the operation of the aviation facility. These are all significant issues. And the 3 categories or venues that I identified were governmental, operational, and community. Okay. Community lends itself to intergovernmental relations, because you're dealing with citizen groups, you're dealing with schools, you're dealing with the other issues and such. Governmental, as I just mentioned, is federalism. You're definitely dealing with the governmental organizations that you're talking about here, so those guys are constantly engrossed in these issues. And of course, operational. As I mentioned before, the aviation environment is possibly the most dangerous known to man, because there's always a constant possibility, if you will, of a disaster taking place. I've heard it said that an aviation facility is always a takeoff and a landing away from an accident or an incident or a major catastrophe. Those are the types of things that these managers are confronted with regularly. So, under the governmental category, we talked about 3 things. One is the success of managers is directly related to their cognizance of group dynamics and functioning with members in regards to managing public organizations. This is significant as boards control the actions of managers. This is done primarily through limitations or parameters placed on the manager. As I said before, some of these facilities are governed by authorities or bodies of people, and they seek to control the actions of the manager simply by having budgetary limits. That's just one of the things that he has to deal with from a governmental standpoint. I'm not going to go through every one of them, but those are the kind of things that they have to deal with. Okay. The next category, continue on, is operational. As I talked about operational, the general aviation facilities are perfect alternate use facilities with the various types of operations. All of the managers offered at least one example of where their airport was the host of a political, military, or governmental dignitary. Arriving at a GA facility offers a low-profile, low-security facility that dignitaries can avoid many public nuisances associated with traveling to larger facilities. Again, though, operational is not just dealing with people coming in and out of the facility. You're dealing with the employees and the various organizations that they have to deal with. You're dealing with information technology and the constant changes that are the constant need to keep up with information technology and the changes therein. You're dealing with safety, which is probably the primary issue of managing from an operational standpoint, the safety implications of an aviation facility. And then now, since 2001, when we had the 9/11 situation, it has become security also. So these are operational things that the aviation manager has to deal with. And then from a community aspect, just for the most part, there was often conflicts with local communities. There were minor, rare complaints, like, for instance, noise generation from aircraft operations. Another thing that's an issue with aviation facilities basically is at times, because of the safety implications we talked about before, there's often a need to procure property outside and surrounding the facility to make sure that those areas are in compliance with safety standards that are surrounding the facility itself. So these are just some of the things in the three categories we talked about that the managers have to deal with. Or those are the findings, the three areas that I put the findings under that are the areas that they have to deal with. Okay. Now, the study, let's talk about the study itself and its limitations. Okay, the limitations of the study were obvious. The study was limited to GA facilities in the state of North Carolina. So obviously there's 49 other states in the country, and we don't have a representative sample of all of them, obviously. There are over 60 in the state, non-portable convenience sampling of 10 managers was selected, sufficient for this research. But the other limitations are is that it only addressed general topics and did not specifically address any item in particular. For instance, I mentioned the demographic matter as far as the managers of the facilities being of a specific demographic. This study didn't specifically address anything. It was a fact-finding, phenomenological study of the managers themselves in their own environments. Other limitations included the time to be spent with each manager. I only spent a couple hours with them. I mean, I didn't really spend days with them, but then the thing you have to be careful about is when you start spending so much time with a research subject, you change the category of which they become. For instance, you go from being a phenomenological study to perhaps a case study, and that would have been outside of what the parameters of this study were. Okay. The other thing is that the data came from preliminary survey and public records. Gathering and using data from these three sources facilitated the requirement of triangulation. That was a limitation in itself. So basically, I only used 3 sources. I could have used more, but and additionally, only the manager was interviewed of these facilities, not any members of their staff or governing body. For instance, if I really wanted to get a different perspective about what was going on in these facilities, I probably could have talked to people other than the manager. For instance, most of those facilities actually had fuel sales operations there. Well, if I really wanted to know the effectiveness of those fuel cells, I probably would have wanted to talk to the people who were actually handling the fuel, the contractor or the person who sells the fuel. But that's just an example of the limitations of the study. Okay, so recommendation for action. My first recommendation was that insights for other managers and for perhaps managers from other professions can be gained from experiences of others. Surely if you present these experiences, then other people can learn from them. Any manager of any local government facility or entity would benefit from understanding the dynamics of intergovernmental relations and federalism. Any manager of any public facility needs to understand those two concepts. That's a recommendation for action. I would recommend anybody, not just aviation facility managers. but anyone to understand those concepts. Third, students and researchers who wish to research an untapped profession devoid of literature and functional research should use the canvassing qualitative phenomenological approach, employing in-depth interviews to establish a framework for future research. I would recommend using this method to conduct research because I think it was enlightening. You were face-to-face with the individual in their environment, and you witnessed their reacting to various situations. On a number of occasions while I was conducting these studies, these managers had to go and take care of legitimate emergencies at their facilities. I had a chance to ride along and learn quite a bit from them. And from my personal perspective, as I said, these people were my peers at the time. So they had life experiences similar to mine, but they also had different ones. So I learned quite a bit from that standpoint as well. So, recommendations for future research. Obviously, we want to recommend that this kind of study continues, that every state do the same study. And not only for the general aviation facilities, but for military facilities, but for international facilities, all of those that are not general aviation. Someone needs to get in and find exactly what's going on in these places. Implications for social change are simple. Having the knowledge of what understands of these facilities allows us to go in and teach, learn, and make sure that there's a better schooled or versed environment or population of what goes on at these facilities and what the implications are for these managers. So in conclusion, the experience of managing the general aviation facility viewed through the lenses of the managers of these facilities calls for understanding of three venues or categories through which they operate. Those are governmental, operational, and community. The governmental organizations to which they report are the same for which they implement policy. For instance, the FAA, while they're interacting with them, they still have to implement the policies that come down from them. The organizations that report to them are typically operational in nature. And the communities where they operate monopolize their time. And what I mean by that is that all the organizations that are within them, fuel operators, safety personnel, mechanics, maintenance, all of them are operational and they work with them. And not to mention the outside community. They take up the vast majority of their time because they're constantly making sure they understand all the other stuff that's going on that they may not be aware of. Conclusively, the managers in the study are challenged by the complexity of the environments in which they function. So, overall conclusion, the aviation environment is potentially the most dangerous professional setting known to man. This is because of the catastrophe associated with the accidents and incidents occurring on these facilities. The physical environment does not exclude the managers from typical vulnerabilities associated with the normal public management. Although similar in the public management respect, there are countless idiosyncratic issues these managers are confronted with, unlike any other public manager. This research has hopefully laid the foundation for understanding future further research to enlighten the profession and academic interests. So, in conclusion, in summary, what have I talked about? I presented a summary statement in the abstract. I talked about what this research is going to be about. I issued the problem statement. I told you what the problems were. The disproportionate number of accidents occurring at some of these facilities versus the other ones. Conceptual framework and methodology. I talked about using a phenomenological approach that resembled studies from other researchers in the past. Literature review presented and revealed that there were limitations in the type of study that we did. The research questions basically surrounded change implementation in these facilities and any obstacles to this change. The participants, we talked about what they were, and one of the things that stuck out about them was their demographic. The findings, there were 15, spread over 3 categories: operational, community, and governmental. And we talked about the limitations of the study, things that I wasn't able to cover, because I would not have been able to finish the study if I covered too many things. So that led me into recommending specific areas to be studied later on, which are more studies like this in the different areas. And of course, the implications for social change are the more enlightened a community or society, the better able we are to make decisions. So, in conclusion, that's my phenomenological study of North Carolina airports. I'm Robert Benson. If I'll entertain any questions you may have. If not,